Well, thanks a lot, first of all, for the invitation and for the introduction. In reality, I was working in the Max Planck Institute for Psychology Research in what is called a junior group. And this junior group, I come from the field of mechatronics. So in this junior group, there was, we were doing work on what we call now cognitive robotics. Basically, it was a psychology research institute, but there was interest also in how these models, these cognitive models coming from psychology and other areas of the cognitive sciences, how all these models could be used or could be validated somehow in using artificial agents. So that was back in Germany when I was working there. Then I decided to come to Mexico, and since then I've done this lab there, which we call the Laboratorio de Robótica Cognitiva, and we've been working with these models for already pretty long. So this talk summarizes a bit of how this started and what we actually are doing now, which is kind of the latest things that involve these models and all the new things that are around. And still we are talking about this cognitive robotics, or what we like to call cognitive robotics. So usually we hear a long story about what happened in artificial intelligence and the story since the 60s. But this slide summarizes the whole of the problems and issues kind of nicely, you know. So if you've ever read about the history of artificial intelligence, we have all these people in the meeting in the States, in this college in Dartmouth, talking about what computers, what can we do with computers, what do they look like, what can they do, what are they able to actually do. And they decide that actually computers can do the same as brains. And they can do computations, they get input, and then there is some output. And they say, well, okay, so the only thing that we are missing is actually kind of the mind, you know? So the right program to give us the equivalent of a mind. And one of the big bars that are set back then, one of the big tests is, okay, so what's very intelligent human behavior? And they decided, well, chess seems like a very good candidate. And they say, okay, once we have a computer that plays chess and that plays at the level of a master, then we could say that actually it's an intelligent computer. And so we have already in the 90s or 80s this computer from IBM, Deep Blue, which actually well beat Gary Kasparov in a set of 3 games to 2. And the questions started asking, of course, so is this an intelligent computer? Of course, now we have, since then to now, we have other millions of examples of this kind of intelligent behavior. But the interesting thing here is why I use chess is because you have the parts in the bottom, like these images in the bottom. So we have a small child playing with the pieces of chess, and we have a robot. We have a robot that is moving chess pieces, and the nerd joke is that actually a child can do it. And if you change the size of the pieces, there is no problem. If you change the size of the chessboard, there is no problem, and a child can still keep doing it. If you change the weight of the pieces, there is no problem. But what happens in the setup with the robot? So you change the size of the pieces, and we usually say, well, then you need another PhD student to program a new robot. No, that's very difficult. And it came out that actually what we thought it was highly intellectual and very difficult work. So what's on the top, it came out to be well, it's not easy. It came to be achievable. And what we have on the bottom, which is actually interacting with the world, which is actually what was supposed to be easy, or what we think of as something very easy, it actually came out to be the very difficult part. So back in that time that I was working as a postdoc in Germany, what we started thinking, or what was the idea floating around in all these labs, in artificial intelligence labs, is okay. So we need bodies. We need agents that have bodies and that they actually learn through the interaction.
The environment as a child does. So instead of having what we call
what we actually have as a brain in a computer or brain in a bucket, that's actually not very good, and it's not actually working, not giving the results that we need. And I don't know how aware you are of all these discussions that are very, very, yeah, today, you know, about all these chatbots, all these chat GPTs, and all these large language models, and this discussion that there is on whether they are intelligent or not, and can we go through these models to something that we can think of as human intelligence. And that's the very big question. And we decided to go somewhere else. We decided to be a bit more based on what we actually know, which might be very few, about the actual behavior of humans and the actual ways of functioning of the human brain and, well, other species. So for us, one of the main components, the scaffolding of cognition, is something we call internal models. We believe it's something as the foundational stone on the cognition scaffolding, no? So it's what lies on the ground and gives ground to everything. And so if you don't know what's internal models, just give a very quick introduction. So imagine your room in this beautiful scenario, and there's some weather conditions. And so there is a temperature inside of your room, and there is central heating, very fancy central heating, where you can actually say, okay, my desired temperature is 21 degrees. So I set my thermostat to 21 degrees. And what happens then is the first sun, like this water starts boiling and starts running through all the pipes, and the water in the room starts increasing. So I keep warming the water, and what happens in control theory, I don't know if you have control theory classes, you know this problem. So the water starts, the temperature of the water starts rising, and there is a point that it goes on top of, or after, like more than 21 degrees, and that's when do I switch off the heating of the water? So we need some sort of feedback.
We are almost going there. We are almost in the.
It's a mess with my earphones. Sorry. It's
a very yeah, we're almost getting to the temperature, so we switch off the water, and what happens is that we still get what we call an overshoot. So the variables that we usually have is we call temperature, but we use S as a sensory situation. So in this case, our sensory situation is the temperature. We have an ST, which is the current temperature when I switch on my device. And we have ST+1, what we call the desired temperature. So I want my system, whatever the system is, in this case, the room temperature or the room, I want it to go from a sensory situation ST, which is the temperature which I'm now in, I want to go to an ST+1, which is where do I want to go? So I want to go to 21 degrees. And in these systems, in these internal models, when we talk about internal models, then we also have an M that means motor command. In this case, we can think of as the switch of the heater, no? So we have an MT. And if you've taken control theory, you know that you need a controller that gives you, that takes as an input an ST and an ST+1. So basically it tells you, I am here, I want to go here, which is the motor command MT, which is going to bring me there. So this is usually called an inverse model. And what we have is a sensory situation and a desired sensory situation at time t+1. And an inverse model tells me what's the motor command that I need to go there. But we have the usual behavior here. I don't know if you can see my pointer, but you have the temperature rising, and this is my desired temperature. But when I switch off my heater, I still have an overshoot of the temperature going a bit over the top. And then I switch off my water, and then it starts going down, and then I switch it on again a bit, and then until I come what I call a steady, or what it's called a steady state, right? So that's the right temperature where I want to get. Obviously, control theory, the whole story and mathematics behind control theory is how can I make this overshoot the smallest possible? So you can imagine it's impossible to go from here to here and then get steady state. That would be like a perfect system, no? So the usual thing is, okay, I need some feedback that tells me how the temperature is changing. So how I can get the best result here, the smallest overshoot, right? So in neuroscience, they realized at some point that, so this is 80s, 90s, when we do a trajectory, so say we want to grasp a glass, so I want to go and grasp my glass, and what happens, it's exactly the same. We have exactly the same situation here. So we need some feedback, and we need some control so that my muscles perform the perfect trajectory. So if you ever notice, you never do any jerking situation when you want to grasp something. It's very smooth trajectories that we usually do. So what happens? The proposal back then was to say, okay, there is something which we call the forward model or predictor. What this forward model does is that it says, okay, so I have this sensory situation, this in the case that we were talking, we have a temperature, room temperature, and I have a motor command. So I ask the forward model, what's going to happen if, given this sensory situation, I apply this motor command? And what is going to happen is I'm going to have a predicted sensory situation. So when I couple this with the inverse model, so I ask the inverse model, okay, what's the motor command that I need to go from ST to ST+1? The inverse model tells me, okay, you need MT. And the forward model, we ask the forward model, okay, given this sensory situation and this motor command, so what's going to happen? Okay, so you are going to have this sensory situation, this predicted sensory situation at time t+1. And so this is what we call a prediction. And predictions become something very important in these kind of systems, including humans, no? So we make use of these predictions for all types of behaviors. So before we go to that, I like to show you a bit more complicated diagram. It's still the same, but what happens when, for example, I use this predicted sensory situation, I use it back as my next sensory situation, yeah? And then the result of that again, so that's what we call long-term predictions. So an example is, so wherever you are now in the auditorium, close your eyes and think of all the things that you would need to do to walk to the door. So you start doing predictions. Okay, so first thing I have to do is stand up, then turn to the right, then walk maybe 5 steps, and then turn to the left, and then walk another 5 steps, and then I'm on the door. And it comes out that throughout history of psychology, cognitive psychology, there is loads of experiments that have proved that we do, and we are very good and very precise on doing these kind of predictions, right? So this is what we see here as long-term predictions. And then we have lots of interesting things here. So what happens when I say, okay, my prediction, my forward model tells me this is going to be the sensory situation at t+1. But the world tells me, okay, what happened? The sensory situation is this. Yeah. So you could imagine it's the thermometer in the room that tells you, okay, you predicted there was going to be 20 degrees, but there is actually 20.5. So we have an error here. This is what we call the prediction versus the world, no? And then we have this error, which comes out to be the very important one. We have other errors, for example, between what I predicted and what I desired. So this here. And we have the world versus what I desired. But the important one is this one. So I make a prediction, I act upon the world, and then there is some consequences in the world. And how my predictions differ to what happened in the world is what we call the prediction error. Okay, and this is what this talk is all about. But going back to internal models and why they are so important, we think that the internal model is actually an internal model of the agent himself in the world, right? And I don't know how familiar you are with this history in artificial intelligence, robotics, etc. This is not going against what everyone now talks and always cites on the world. The world is the best model of itself, no? These statements or these quotes of Rodney Brooks saying, no, we don't need models inside the agents because the world is the best model. It's not really that kind of model that we're talking about, because we're not talking about that representation of the world as such inside the robot or inside an agent, inside the brain. We're talking about a model of what happens, how is the interaction of an agent with the world, and how that shapes its behavior. And these models, of course, are learned through interaction with the environment. And we believe it's constitutive of the agent. So it tells the agent what to do, how to do it, and when to do it. So it's something very embodied. So I'll give you just a couple of examples of these internal models. A very interesting one is, well, I'll just tell you one. Blinking. I don't know if you've ever wondered why you never see the inside of your eyelashes, of your, yeah? So because you blink every, I don't know how long, every how often, but a blink lasts 300 milliseconds. And the usual answer when you ask people this is, oh, because a blink is so fast, we cannot actually perceive it consciously. But it comes out that it's actually not true. If you switch off the light in a control environment for 300 milliseconds, any person is going to detect and consciously perceive this darkening of, for example, of a room, right? So it's not really that it's too fast. It's the reason here, or the explanation that it's now given, is you are the author, you are the owner of the motor commands that perform the blink. And basically what you are doing is predicting what's the image, what's the visual information that you would get when you are actually not seeing. This is sometimes, and if you think about it, it can be very disturbing, because that means that lots of what we believe is our reality, our perception, it's actually a prediction of our brain. So our brain is saying, okay, there is going to be a blink. There is going to be the eyelash close. The eye is going to basically be shut for 300 milliseconds, but you don't see a dark screen every now and then. So what we actually see is a prediction. As Anil said, in a very nice talk that he has on in the internet, you can check it. He says, or he calls it, most of our perception is an hallucination because it's actually predictions of our brain about reality. Okay, so well, I won't bore you with more evidence. If you want, we can talk about it at the end. When we see this small pairing of inverse and forward models, we can see it up here. Pickering and Clark in 2014 put it like this. So it's exactly the same. It's only slightly different names and different ways of putting all the connections. But here we have a desired motor trajectory, which is the same to saying we have an ST to an ST plus 1. The inverse model tells us, okay, motor command brings us to the system, the world, no? And then we have the actual motor trajectory. We have the sensory system telling us what actually happened. We have an estimated sensory feedback, so the desired ST plus 1, the prediction. And the important thing is, okay, we have this prediction error that goes back and actually helps the system learn. So it says, okay, you had this prediction error. What do we do with this prediction error? Well, the prediction error is the basis for learning, for modifying our model, right? So, so far so good. We have all these control theories up to the late 90s. And then when we start the 2000s, there's all this noise coming from everywhere and these new proposals of what in Clark's words is the predictive brain. And it starts being called differently. And one of the many names that it has is predictive processing. For those of you that are not familiar, it's a very interesting literature, but it's very confusing. So because of that, last year, I think we took the task of writing an article trying to disentangle these names. It's called predictive processing in robotics, in cognitive robotics. And what we try to do, because what I mean with this disentanglement is because there is something called predictive processing, and then it comes to be called active inference, and then it comes to be called free energy principle. And sometimes they are used in exchange, like in the same paper, in one page, they say predictive processing, in the next one, they say active inference. And so we try to make a bit of a distinction between all these ideas, but they all share lots of, well, they all share the core principles. And one of them is they get rid of the inverse model. So they say that an inverse model is something that cannot exist. There is some mathematical objections of why it cannot exist. It's not possible to learn. And it gets changed to this. So it's exactly, well, it's very similar to what we saw before, only that we have this intended action. So we have the ST and the ST plus 1. And now they call something an integral forward model. And then there is only predictions. They call them descending predictions. So in one side, you have predicted sensory, very importantly here, exteroceptive consequences. Okay, so that's all this external sensations, all this external information that comes into the system, which sometimes is called corollary discharge. Then we have the actual system and a sensory prediction error, again, exteroceptive. Very importantly, how the inverse model, how do they get rid of the control of the inverse model? So they say, okay, there is predicted sensory consequences, but in this case, it's proprioceptive, right? And they say, okay, that's actually what we know as motor commands. So it's predictions about about the proprioceptive consequences of what happens in the world when we move. And that's actually motor commands that when they come to the motor plant again, they become a sensory prediction error, but in this case, proprioceptive. So they say, okay, there is two kinds of prediction error. One is related to all the sensory situations, all the sensory input and information that we receive. And the other one is proprioceptive. Yeah, so it's all to do with motor information. Active inference and all, as I said, all these new schools of thought have become highly popular in the neuroscience literature and well, also in some areas of robotics and people doing control in terms of robotics. And there is lots of controversies, and the main thing here is, well, just to give you a very nice example, just to be quick on it's not the main part of the talk, say, but just to know what we are talking about. So imagine like the usual processing of information proposed back then in the 60s, 70s, 80s, when we start having cameras and we start having access to all these experiments in psychology. And the idea is, okay, so you have visual processing of information, you have an input, and then you start segmenting this information first, like the big details, then you start going into whatever colors and then edges, then you form objects, and then at the end you have a perception of the world that you saw out there. And it was very similar what was thought about, like how a computer can do it, how a computer can do all this processing, and how a human can have an image and a perception of the world. The difference here, the difference in active inference or predictive processing, or however you want to call it, is what they actually say is you have perceptions of the world. So think about this. Well, I'll tell you the example first, and then we go to this diagram. So imagine that you go into, what's the big problem about the standard picture of this processing? There is a lot of information. So when you see an image, when you see a scene, let's talk about the visual domain, because it's usually the easiest to understand. So when you see an image, when you see a scene, there is a lot of information. And there is something called a bottleneck. So it was so difficult to imagine how this processing could be done with all this so much information. So the idea of active inference and predictive processing, what they are saying is, we don't need to do all this processing. We don't need to always have this bottom-up information that comes from the world. We only need to process what's actually different. So what active inference is doing is, what he's saying mainly is, okay, so when you have a scene, there is 90% of the information that it's there, you already know it. You can do a prediction about it. So when you go into your room, you don't need to process all the things that are inside your room, like whatever, your shoes, your socks thrown there somewhere, and your picture, and your desk, and your backpack, everything. No. So what's what you are going to actually process? So predictive processing says, okay, so there is a new desk that somebody came and changed while you weren't there. That becomes an error. That's not something that you were actually expecting. That's a difference between what you actually predicted and what's in the room, what's in the world. So predictive processing now, what they claim, or what we believe it happens, is you only process what's different, and what's different, it's the prediction error, okay? And there is two ways of seeing this. So this is what I just told you is what happens with exteroceptive information. So in this case, visual. So you have all this information. Yeah, I don't need to process all that. I am only going to process upwards, and that's what we see here in red. I'm going to process upwards the error. I have descending predictions, so intentions, which actually go down to do a prediction about the world, in this case here, exteroceptive, and in this case, proprioceptive, yeah? But let's not go so much into that. I hope I give you a rough idea about all this. What's interesting here is the importance of the prediction error, because minimizing prediction error, as we can read here, is what leads to belief updating. So the change of a prior belief of what I thought, yeah? And this is what we call informational gain. And in other words, it's learning. So in active inference, the expected future states are fulfilled through action execution, okay? The associated expected prediction error is minimized by actively sampling sensory information. So that's what makes us move and look for information, okay? But there is something very nice here, and it's what we call the expected prediction error. So we don't only have a prediction error, but we have an expected prediction error. So think about when you want to, whatever, learn a new task, learn to play squash. You've only, all your life, you play tennis, but now they invite you to play squash. And so there is weird things. There is a smaller racket, there is a smaller ball, smaller court, but you have a lot of experience of how to handle a racket, how to interact with the ball. And so when you start playing, you have an expected prediction error because you know how bad or how good you can be because of your previous experience. And so the attribute of a policy, and what's a policy? It's just like a sequence of actions, can be epistemic and instrumental. So when we talk about epistemic information or our policies, we are talking about novelty searching, yeah? So we are trying to learn something new and we act for information. And on the other hand, we have instrumental actions or instrumental affordances, which means we are acting for a reward. But anyway, in general, active inference can be characterized as the process of selecting the relevant affordances in the world. I don't know if you are familiar with the term affordances, something very beautiful in cognitive science, but I'll go to it now in case you don't know it. So these affordances are those which are expected to minimize prediction error in a context-sensitive manner, okay? And what does it mean, like, to select affordances? So what's an affordance? An affordance is actually what the world, it's a very complex concept and it has a long history in cognitive science, but we can summarize it as the world and the objects in the world, what we call the landscape of affordances, all the things in the world afford something to us. And it's funny because in Spanish, actually, we haven't found a translation for this term. We still use affordance. And it's, think of it as the easiest and most common example is when you see a chair or an object that it's a chair, looks like a chair. The way to think about it in these terms is you don't see a chair, but what you perceive, it's the seatability of the object. You see that it's actually some object where you can sit, and this sitting elicits lots of activation in the brain that it's related to this object. So you can sit on it, you can rest, you can have the memories of your granny and the chair where she used to sit and the smell of her room, but all these feelings and all these actions, so the action of sitting, the feeling of being resting, etc., they are surrounding this object, and that's what the object affords. That's what we call affordance. Okay. So we talk here about relevant affordance, selecting relevant affordances. How do we do this task selection? How do we do this relevance selection? This affordance selection, sorry. And here is where we start talking about prediction error dynamics. And it's very interesting. This is something rather new. We have only written a couple of papers. One came last year, 2022, and the other one is in 2020. And there's very few things out there about this. And we believe that actually embodied feelings are the key for this task selection. Embodied feelings allow a certain sensitivity to how well or bad we are doing at improving the grip on what is actually relevant in what I just said, the landscape of affordances. So we can go back to this example of playing squash. So you are doing very good. You are learning the difference now with the size of the racket, the size of the ball, how the ball bounces. So you start improving. Your prediction error starts getting better. So you start having a negative scope, so like here, on how your prediction error is moving. So you feel fine. You feel it's something that you want to keep doing. But imagine that for whatever reason, the racket is not responding to what you were expecting. So your expected prediction error is very different from what's actually happened. So it's happening. So you just don't get better. You keep doing the same mistake. You keep throwing it somewhere else. You cannot just get it right. What happens? Well, your prediction error keeps growing or keeps being the same, but it's not improving. What happens is you just get frustrated and then you say, okay, I don't want to learn squash. I want to go and play ping pong. No, so I just change my task. And that's what we are proposing. The sensitivity to changes in the rate of prediction error reduction is what we know as prediction error dynamics, okay? The steeper the slope, the faster the rate of reduction, obviously. And some people already had suggested that prediction error dynamics are manifested as changes on affect, so on how we feel about what we are doing. If the rate of reduction error is faster than expected, so we have a positive balance and an action policy which is actually more precise. Slower than expected or increasingly unexpectedly, so we have a negative balance and action policy which is less precise. And we can talk a bit about some of the implementations. First, we have one of the standard ones with the internal models. We have here an hour robot looking at a spot in a black wall. And the idea is implementing these internal models, these forward inverse models, using sums, which is actually something I wanted to talk a bit longer in a workshop, but well, we couldn't do it. We have here a system that codes motor commands and sensory situations. In this case, oh, wow. Sorry, I didn't know we had so few time. And that's we started late. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about this. If we only have 5 minutes and I would like to get some questions, I think I would like to go to this and try to explain you this. This is our proposal from last year already. It's actually what we believe it could be the way that a system could learn, an artificial system. We believe that this encapsulates most of what we have or what we know about not only artificial systems, but biological systems. And I'll go through this very fast. We start with a system that has physiological needs, or actually asks whether it has, or does a revision, whether it has physiological needs. When it has physiological needs, it goes here through this emotions checking, okay? So whether it's a positive or a negative emotion, and then it checks the world. The world is full of affordances, which are actually spatial configuration of the body and the objects, as well as the relational properties in the world. So we have here the environmental context, we have the agent-related context. So this diagram or this model, it's about context and how context, the different types of context that there are, play or interact for task selection and basically acting on the world. So once we have a field of affordances, we select a task depending on the expected error reduction rate, so the error dynamics. We do planning, which means what do I need to do to fulfill this task? And as I execute this task, I do two types of monitoring of the prediction error. I do a very short one, an instantaneous one, which tells me, okay, you are doing fine. How can you change your body and object configuration for continuing on this planning? And I do one which is actually checking on a space, on a buffer, how is the prediction error moving in terms of the slope, okay? So if the slope is positive, okay, then I go back and keep doing what I'm doing. It's fine, it's doing fine. If the slope is negative after a while, then it just doesn't work, it doesn't make sense. So I'll just go back to this starting point. So if I need to fulfill a physiological need, then I go here. So I have to look for food. I look what affords me food, what's going to satisfy that feeling. And then I go back here again. When I don't need to satisfy a physiological need, I go to what we call, or what is known as intrinsic motivation. So I want to learn something new, okay? That intrinsic motivation moves me through the emotions to do something else, okay? So this model, even though it looks a bit complicated and it's the last thing that encapsulates what we've been working on, prediction error dynamics and internal models, and puts it into the general context, and includes what we call grounded cognition, situated cognition, embodied cognition, affective cognition. So it takes a lot of things that are out there and tries to give a bit of an explanation and put everything into its place in what we are proposing as a way of having agents that can interact. We believe it's very much inspired on what we know about humans, and we believe it's a very good way of having an agent be adaptive and learning in the physical world. So I think with that, I would like to finish. Yeah, I would like to have some questions rather.
Thank you very much. Who would like to? Okay.
Hi, Bruno. I don't know if you can hear me well.
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay. Well, thank you for your talk. It was awesome. Well, I have like two questions that could be mixed in one. You spoke about the free energy principle, which is the Freestone one. And on the other hand, you show us a representation or a circuit which looks a lot like the Kodam model for corollary discharge and that kind of things. And both of those frameworks or those models have been proposed for explaining consciousness, at least partially, or it's an idea. Would you say that your robotics and what you're doing is perhaps a step ahead into the consciousness in robotics, at least at some point?
Consciousness is a bit of a topic that I'm not very comfortable talking about. It's very difficult to talk about that. I don't usually have a working definition for consciousness, and I think that nobody does. So it's something that I don't like to go into, but I don't know if you mean about, I mean, the idea here, I don't know which one you said that we are proposing. This is what was known for what it's called just control theory or classical control theory, where you have an inverse model and a forward model that does a prediction, and that's how you get control. The top one is the one that I've always used in my papers. The bottom one is the one that Pickering and Clark proposed in this paper in 2014, where they start putting the principles of what they back then called predictive processing. And this one here is the one that they say, okay, that one is over. We can think of everything now here. And this is not very different, very different from Freestone's idea of the free energy principle. So I mentioned this paper that we have, and it's, if you want to look for it, it's in computational neuroscience, together with Giovanni Pezzullo and Verena Hafner. And we are trying to do this review of precisely that, like what's active inference, what's predictive processing, what's the difference, what's the free energy principle, what's the Markov blankets, etc., etc. Because they all talk and they all share a lot of core elements and core ideas. Do they talk about consciousness? Not all of them, and not everyone is very comfortable with that. We are trying to talk about perception and how we perceive the world, how we can make sense of what we perceive and how we can interact with the world. If you are interested on corollary discharge and all these ideas on sensory motor contingencies, I would recommend you Julian Kirbenstein's paper on can a robot have a subjective point of view? I mean, the short answer for what you were saying, sorry, is yes, it's an approach. I'm not going to say, yeah, my robots that have these models are conscious, but it's kind of, that's the way we believe. So once an agent knows he or she is the author and the owner of the changes, sensory changes in the world, given its motor interaction with it, then it can be a way to achieve a subjective point of view. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, perfectly. Thank you. And it's nice to see a robot that implements the free energy principle.
I wouldn't say there is one out there in the world. The closest that you can get is the implementations that, yeah, exactly, Giovanni Pezzullo and the implementations of Pablo Lanillos. And actually, in this paper that I was telling you, there is a very long review of all the papers that have, in principle, proposed or claim to have implemented something on active inference, free energy, blah, blah, blah. And we do a bit of a criticism on what's actually happening, what they are claiming, and what's actually what happened. No? So if you ask me now, I would only say there is the implementations of Pablo Lanillos, the implementations of, who else I said? Of Giovanni Pezzullo, and the implementations of Jun Tani. For me, that's the closest that you could get to the implementations of the free energy or active inference, but still they are very much aware of their shortcomings and of the things that they are not able to actually implement, no, for computational reasons and etc., etc.
Okay, hi, I'm a different person. I'm interested.
We are all different.
I'm going to ask a question, maybe it's too specific, but I'm interested in a particular part of the last diagram you showed. And it's the line between emotions and planning, because it reminds me about Damasio's work on the somatic marker and that kind of
Yeah, of course, it's all inspired. I mean, I didn't have this is a very short talk, and I invite you to read our paper. There is a reference there. Of course, it refers to Damasio. It has inspiration. All our work has inspiration on all this literature. Actually, here the idea is you either have positive or negative emotions. The idea here is when you have a monitoring, because all of this is centered on this monitoring of the prediction error, right? So when you have here a slope that it's actually positive, so basically it's saying, oh no, you're doing it very bad, no? So this is what actually lets you change or choose a different task, or if you want to go to continue doing this task. So that's why it goes back here, right? So it says, okay, you are doing fine. Your prediction error dynamics look fine. You are reducing your error as you are acting upon the world. So just go back and continue with the sequence that you are doing, right? So you are learning pretty good how to hit the squash ball. Just keep doing it. You are learning right. Your prediction error is decreasing, so you are getting better at it, right? So go back to it. You are doing fine. That's what this line means. When it goes here, it's like, no, come on. You are not good at this. You keep throwing it in the wrong direction. You keep not using the right force. So go and play ping pong or something else.
Okay, thank you.
I don't know if that answers your questions, but definitely, yeah, it's inspired on this. It's inspired also on Barcelow's work. Well, everyone's work. So of course, as every paper, it's just stepping on lots of little stones and trying to go a bit further.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Is there another question? Okay, one sec.
Thanks. Hi, I would like to ask, which kind of intrinsic motivations have you tested? What are those about, and what have you find that are like key for developing?
Well, this is actually a kind of a theoretical model that we're proposing, right? And when we talk about intrinsic motivation, we talk about all these like drives to learn. That's the only thing that I can tell you. There is no implementation in this case, but it's all these motivations for learning. That's what it's intrinsic motivation, this exploration for an agent to keep learning. So it's not a work on other yours and Hafner's proposals of intrinsic motivation in artificial agents, etc., etc. It's just like a very abstract thinking on saying, okay, so if I don't have physiological needs, I can go to my intrinsic motivation module and to my drive for learning something new, then I can go out into the world.
Okay. Thank you very much, Bruno. And with this, we would like to really give you a big applause and thank you very much for being present in La Coro.